She paid just $750 for an abandoned auto shop on the edge of town. A sagging roof, cracked windows, and memories no one wanted. But beneath the floorboards, where the concrete sounded hollow and the past whispered through rusted vents, she uncovered a tunnel sealed since the 1940 seconds. What waited inside wasn't just a glimpse into history. It was a hidden fortune that would change her life forever. Before we dive into this incredible journey, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of buried secrets and unexpected twists keep you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will leave you speechless. Let's get started. The rain had stopped just an hour before she arrived. The pavement still glistened, cracked and soaked, mirroring the sky in shallow puddles as Casey Lang stepped out of her battered pickup and stared at what she'd just spent her last $750 on. The old auto shop stood hunched at the end of Milner Street, wrapped in ivy and silence, its sign barely legible through years of grime. Walt's Garage, the paint faded, letters crooked. She'd passed this place 100 times as a kid, never once imagining she'd one day own it. The front doors creaked as she pushed them open. They didn't swing, they groaned. One stuck halfway on a warped frame, forcing her to shoulder through. The inside smelled like time had stopped. Oil, rust, mold, dust danced in the faint light that filtered through broken blinds. She stood in the middle of the main bay, water dripping somewhere in the back, and tried to imagine what this place had once been. The garage was long forgotten, the kind of place small towns stopped talking about after a while. No one came here. No one asked why it was boarded up. But for Casey, it was all she could afford, and maybe, if she was lucky, all she needed. She had grease under her nails and fire in her gut. At 28, she'd already been turned away from 6 shops for trying to do what her father taught her: wrench, rebuild, fix things other people gave up on. The last place she worked fired her the day she outdiagnosed the head mechanic. "Not your place," he told her. So, she made one. The office was to the right, door half off its hinges. Inside, the desk was still there, tilted slightly as if tired. Yellowed papers littered the floor. A calendar from 1994 still hung on the wall, curled at the edges, stuck forever in August. She stepped carefully, watching for soft spots in the floor. A rat scurried beneath a filing cabinet. She didn't flinch. In the corner, beneath a pile of old seat cushions, she found a photo, black and white. 4 men, standing proudly in front of the same building she stood in now. One wore coveralls, one held a wrench over his shoulder. The others wore war-era uniforms. None smiled. On the back, in faded blue ink, "Waltz, Summer 44, before the big job." She slipped the photo into her back pocket. Outside, thunder rumbled again, distant this time. She pulled a crowbar from the truck bed and got to work clearing out the main bay. Rusted rims, cracked oil pans, a stack of hubcaps nearly caved in. Every piece felt like a puzzle she hadn't yet seen the picture for. But there was something about the floor, dead center of the room. The concrete was cracked in a strange line, almost like a seam. And when she walked across it, her boot echoed, not like the rest of the floor. Hollow. She paused, knelt, tapped once, and the sound that came back wasn't silence. It was a secret, waiting. Casey sat back on her heels, listening. The echo beneath the floor wasn't just a trick of acoustics. It was sharper, more metallic. She stood slowly, heart beating a little faster now, and stepped back across the seam. Hollow again, definitely. She tapped her boot twice, more solid on one side, empty on the other. Something was beneath the shop. Something big enough to change the way sound traveled through concrete. She marked the spot with a spray of red grease pencil from her toolbox, drawing an uneven X in the middle of the bay. Then, as if trying not to spook it, she moved on. There was still too much to clean out, and whatever was down there, it wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. The sun began to lower in the sky, slanting light through the shattered front window. It gave the dust a kind of golden glow, and for a second, Casey could almost imagine what the place must have looked like back when it was alive. Tools hanging neatly on the walls, engines purring on lifts. Walt, maybe, wiping his hands on a rag, radio humming something slow from the corner. She found herself talking out loud, just a whisper. "We're gonna bring you back." The back room was worse. Darker, mustier, filled with broken shelving and stacked crates that looked untouched since Clinton was president. She pried one open mice nests, old belts, a cracked distributor cap. But the next crate made her pause. Inside, folded blue coveralls, neatly stacked. The name stitched above the breast, Walt. Beneath the uniform lay a heavy clipboard, its pages curled with moisture, ink bleeding through yellowed paper. Handwritten entries logged with precision. Oil changes, engine rebuilds. And then something strange. Line after line marked, "Parts inbound, tunnel route." She flipped through. There it was again. Tunnel route. Casey frowned. She looked around the room, now not just as a mechanic but like a detective. Her father used to say, "A good garage has bones, and sometimes those bones have secrets." At the far wall, behind a leaning shelf, she spotted a square cutout in the paneling. Not big, maybe a crawl space, maybe nothing. She yanked the shelf aside. The wall groaned in protest, and a cloud of dust exploded into her face. She coughed, waved it off, and stared. The panel wasn't a wall at all. It was a door. A wooden one, nailed shut from the inside, the edges nearly invisible under grime. No handle, just a small brass hinge half rotted in place. She pressed her palm against it. Cold, still solid. Something shifted behind her, just a draft, she told herself. Just air moving in a space that hadn't breathed in years. But it didn't feel like just air. It felt like a presence. Like someone had once stood in this same room, hand on the same panel, wondering whether to open it and chose not to. Casey turned back to her tools. Tomorrow, she'd come with a hammer and crowbar and answers in her chest. But tonight, she simply stood in the quiet shop and listened again to the space beneath her boots. The ghosts weren't speaking yet, but they would. Soon, the next morning arrived in shades of silver. Low clouds blanketed the town, and fog clung to Milner Street like it had a secret to keep. Casey pulled into the gravel lot just as the sky shifted from pewter to pale blue. Coffee in one hand, toolbox in the other. She didn't hesitate. The moment she stepped inside the garage, the air felt heavier charged, somehow. Like the building itself knew what she was about to do. She set the crowbar down next to the panel in the back room. But before she dealt with that, she returned to the middle of the bay. The red grease X she'd drawn the day before stared back at her from the cracked concrete. It wasn't much, just a scrawl on a floor, but it felt like an invitation. She dropped to one knee and rapped her knuckles along the seam again. Hollow, unmistakably. She pulled out a socket wrench and tapped along the perimeter just as she used to when hunting for weak spots in rusted truck beds. After 5 minutes, she'd traced a rough square about 4 feet wide. A hatch, covered in decades of grime and oil and denial. Casey stood, cracked her back, and exhaled. "All right then," she whispered. She got to work. Scraping away the layers was slow and brutal. She soaked the perimeter in degreaser, chipped away with a chisel, careful not to crack anything too deep. After an hour, sweat clung to her collarbone and her palms stung, but the outline was fully exposed now. A steel-framed hatch, bolted down with half-inch lugs and smeared in what had once been tar. It wasn't part of the original shop plans, she was sure of that. She fetched her impact driver. The first bolt screamed but turned. The second snapped clean in half. The third refused to move, even as her arms trembled and her shoulders burned. But the fourth, with one final groan, it released, and the hatch shifted a half-inch on its own, as if exhaling. Casey froze. The scent that rose up wasn't rot, it wasn't mold. It was old fuel, dust, dry metal, like the inside of a sealed engine that hadn't turned in half a century. She leaned in and pried the edge up with the crowbar. It creaked, then groaned, then finally gave way with a puff of stale air and rust flakes. Below, darkness. A short wooden ladder descended maybe 10 feet into a narrow shaft lined with crumbling brick. A single bulb hung from a rusted wire halfway down, but the cord was severed. No light, just shadow and silence. Casey grabbed her flashlight and lowered herself in slowly, each rung giving off an eerie creak beneath her boots. The air grew cooler as she descended, and when her feet finally hit solid ground, she swept the beam in a slow arc. Tunnel, narrow, hand-carved, reinforced with timber and stone, maybe 6 feet high, just wide enough for a person and a dolly. A railway track, yes. A track ran down the center, old and warped, but unmistakable. "What the hell were you doing, Walt?" she whispered to herself. Then she caught at something at her feet. A crate, splintered at the corner, stamped with a barely legible seal. U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. 1,944. Her throat tightened. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just a garage. It was a passage into a different time, a different war, and possibly a different truth. Casey knelt beside the crate, her flashlight beam trembling just slightly. The wooden planks were dry but solid, the seal faded but unmistakable. U.S. Army Ordnance. The label had half flaked off, but the date held firm, the 2nd of July 1944. Her fingertips traced the corners of the lid, feeling the weight of history not just as a concept, but as something real, physical, hidden beneath decades of silence. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she turned the light down the length of the tunnel. The tracks curved gently to the left, disappearing into deeper shadow. Cobwebs hung in sheets from the overhead beams, and a fine layer of dust covered everything like time's fingerprint. She stood, slowly, heart loud in her ears, and walked 10 cautious steps deeper. Then, she saw it. Another crate, this one overturned. Its contents, long since spilled and scattered. Torn canvas, rotten rope, a metal canister rusted shut. And beside it, something out of place. A tin lunchbox, battered and dented, its latch broken. She picked it up, turned it in her hands, and opened it gently. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, was a folded sheet of paper and a key. The key was iron, old and pitted, looped with a thin red string. It had no tag, no number, just weight, purpose. The paper, yellow and brittle, unfolded with a careful crackle. Typed, faded. Some kind of inventory? No more personal. The top line read, "Property of Walter McBride. If found, deliver to Anna Weller, 118 Parkhurst Lane." Casey blinked. Anna Weller. That name, it tugged something from the back of her mind. She'd heard it before. Somewhere. Maybe in town. Maybe in her father's stories. But the address was a dead end. Parkhurst Lane had been demolished years ago. It was part of the flood zone now. Gone. She tucked the key into her coat pocket, folded the paper carefully, and stood. The tunnel pressed in around her. Not threatening, but watchful. Like it wanted her to keep going, but only if she respected its silence. Back at the ladder, she hesitated before climbing. Her flashlight caught one more detail, etched into the brick just above the hatch frame. "No matter what you find, fix it." It was scratched in crude, uneven strokes, like someone wrote it in a hurry or in desperation. It didn't say who. It didn't need to. When she emerged back into the shop, the daylight stung her eyes. Everything up here suddenly felt too normal. The cracked windows, the dust, the empty lift. But everything had changed. That tunnel was more than just a secret. It was a story someone had hidden on purpose. She stood in the bay, holding the key in one hand, the paper in the other. Her father used to say, "Every lock you find is proof someone wanted something kept safe." She turned the key in her palm and whispered, "So what were you protecting, Walt?" Outside, the wind had picked up, and somewhere deep below, the tunnel waited. Casey didn't sleep much that night. The key lay on her bedside table, the red string coiled like a question mark, and every time she closed her eyes, She saw that tunnel dark, breathless, humming with the weight of stories no one had told. She dreamed of voices echoing off stone, of footsteps in dust, of a hand reaching out in the dark that never quite touched hers. When dawn crept through the blinds, she was already pulling on her boots. By the time she returned to the shop, the fog had burned off, and the early October air was cool and dry. She parked her truck close this time, loaded with tools. Headlamp, pry bar, bolt cutters, gloves, a backpack, water. She didn't know what she expected to find. She only knew she had to keep going. Down the ladder again, she descended into the hush of the past. The air was still, thick with the scent of aged metal and dried wood. Dust shifted in slow spirals as she moved. The narrow walls pressed close around her, and every footstep echoed like it had traveled too far. She followed the track deeper this time. The curve led into a section reinforced with cinder block, newer than the rest, maybe added in the 60 seconds. There were light fixtures overhead, none working, but the wiring ran clean and straight. Someone had maintained this place long after the war. Someone had kept it hidden. The next chamber opened up suddenly. A small square room with shelving built into the stone. Several crates lined the walls, their markings barely visible. A map hung on the far wall, pinned under cracked glass. She stepped closer, brushed off a layer of dust. It was a layout of the town, no older than the current one, maybe from the 1942. There were circles drawn in red ink. The garage, the rail yard, and 3 other locations now buried under development. In the corner, a faded note in block letters read, "Transfer routes. High value." A chill worked its way down her spine. She turned to one of the shelves. A leather ledger sat on the bottom rack, warped from moisture but still intact. She flipped it open, handwritten entries in tight script. Dates, names, items. The 11th of October 1944. Delivered 6 crates. Destination. Safe House 3. The 2nd of November 1944. Gold bars 10. 4. Classified manifest. Held until clearance. She stared at the page. Gold. Safe houses. What had this place been? A storage site? A relay? It wasn't just military surplus. This was bigger. Deeper. She scanned the ledger again. Near the back, a loose page tucked between entries caught her eye. It wasn't part of the log. It was a letter. "Walt, if you're reading this, I didn't make it out. Keep it sealed until the right person comes along. Not the rich, not the loud. Someone who listens. Someone who knows how to fix broken things." Her hands trembled. The tunnel had stopped being a mystery. It was becoming a message. And maybe, she thought, as she traced her thumb along the faded ink, that person, it was her. Casey sat on the tunnel floor for what felt like an hour, the letter still in her hands, her headlamp flickering slightly against the stone. The silence was different now, not just stillness, but reverence. Like the walls had been holding their breath for decades, waiting for someone to finally hear what they had to say. She read the letter again, slower this time. Not the rich, not the loud. Someone who listens. Someone who knows how to fix broken things. The paper was soft with age but still whole, like it had been protected on purpose. The name signed at the bottom wasn't Walt, but someone else. A.W. Anna Weller. That name again. Casey's breath caught. She reached into her backpack, pulled out the first inventory sheet she'd found in the lunchbox, the one that listed Anna's address. Now it was more than a name, more than a maybe. This was her voice, her hand, her trust placed in someone she never met. For a mechanic who lived in a world of torque specs and rusted bolts, it was a strange thing to be chosen by someone long gone. She carefully tucked the letter into a folder, zipped it away, and turned back to the crates. She opened one. Inside, files. Dozens of them. Wartime correspondences, coded inventory logs, even photographs. Not military, not exactly. These weren't government, stamped reports. They were personal. Notes written in the margins. Polaroids of hidden rooms, shadowed faces, tools being handed off in the dark. These weren't just supply runs. They were smuggling routes. One photo made her go still. It showed the inside of the very room she was sitting in this tunnel chamber. Same shelving, same map. Except in the picture, 3 people stood in the foreground. One in a mechanic's jumpsuit, one in a nurse's uniform, and a man with a hat pulled low, face barely visible. In the center of them, a crate, open, revealing stacks of something wrapped in cloth. She squinted. Not supplies, not parts, stacks of cash. Bundles of wartime currency, some US, some not. Marked, sealed, stored. She exhaled. This wasn't just a hideout. This was a covert operation, and someone had preserved it all, left it waiting. At the back of the chamber, a rusted filing cabinet leaned sideways against the wall. She tried to open the top drawer. Jammed. The second opened with a screech. More letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to Walt McBride. All signed by A.W. She took one out and began reading. Walt, we've secured the second tunnel near the southern junction. The final delivery will arrive Tuesday under cover of the coal shipment. I've hidden the remaining assets in crate 4B. Burn this after reading. It hadn't been burned. It had been filed. Kept. Preserved for someone like her. She leaned back, heart thudding, her breath loud in the stillness. All this time, people had driven past the garage, seen it as nothing more than a relic. But beneath it, history had been humming like a sealed engine. Forgotten, maybe, but never lost. She turned her flashlight deeper into the tunnel. There was more. This was just the first chamber. The echoes hadn't stopped. They were guiding her forward. The tunnel narrowed again, bending like a question mark as Casey moved forward. Her footsteps echoed now with purpose. The flashlight beam skimmed across the walls, catching glimpses of the past, embedded in stone scratches from old hand trucks. Initials carved into timber beams, forgotten footprints frozen in dust. Every inch felt like a breath held too long. She counted crates as she went. Crate 2 amperes. Crate 3C. Then, finally, crate 4B. It was half buried under a pile of collapsed boards, the wood swollen from age, its corners bruised by time. But the markings were still there, barely legible. 4B, clearance only. She dropped to her knees, set her flashlight beside it, and slowly began pulling the boards off, her fingers trembling even through the gloves. When the lid came free with a hollow groan, the air shifted. Not just colder, but heavier. Inside, layers of canvas-wrapped bricks filled the box, their edges bound in twine, some stamped with serial numbers. She lifted one, then another. Underneath, something shimmered faintly beneath dust. Metal. She cleared away the top layer and froze. Gold. Thin bars, tarnished but unmistakable. Some marked with U.S. Treasury seals, others foreign. One she didn't recognize at all, its edges curved, almost ceremonial in design. There was no question anymore. This wasn't leftover military scrap. This was wealth, raw, hidden, forgotten, maybe even illegal, maybe even stolen. But it was here, it was real, and it was untouched. Her chest tightened. This crate alone had to be worth hundreds of thousands, maybe more. And from what she'd seen in the ledgers, there were more of them. Crates scattered along the old rail route, hidden before the war ended, when everything was chaos, when people made decisions they didn't write down. And yet here she was, holding the consequence of one of those decisions. A mechanic from nowhere, standing in a tunnel no one remembered, cradling a bar of gold meant for hands that never returned. Casey set the bar down gently and sat back on her heels, her breath fogged in the cool air. She couldn't stop thinking about the letter. The one that said, "If you're reading this, I didn't make it out." Who didn't make it out? Anna? Walt? Someone else? Entirely? Her mind reeled. What if this tunnel had never been sealed by accident? What if it had been hidden on purpose? Not to protect the treasure, but to protect someone's memory. Suddenly, the gold felt heavier, not in her hands, in her conscience. She reached into the crate again. At the very bottom, beneath the last bar, was a sealed envelope, wax stamped, aged, but intact. Written on the front in block letters. To whoever finds this, it's yours now. Just remember who paid for it. She held the envelope to her chest and closed her eyes. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a debt, unclaimed. Until now. The envelope trembled slightly in Casey's hands as she climbed the ladder out of the tunnel. The afternoon light in the garage felt too bright, too normal, like a lie stretched across the truth she now carried in her backpack. The gold, the letters, the ledger, the crate stamped with time and sealed with silence. Her boots thudded onto the shop floor, but her thoughts stayed buried below. She didn't open the envelope right away. Instead, she stood alone in the center of the bay, hands on her hips, sweat cooling on her back. Around her, the garage seemed to breathe differently now. The broken lift, the buckled tiles, even the rusting shelves, they weren't just junk anymore. They were part of a story, a hiding place, a vault of trust passed down through decades. She remembered what her father used to say, "Money can change your life, but legacy will change your soul." She sat at the old desk in the office and finally broke the wax seal. Inside the envelope, a letter, written in the same blocky hand as the note on the crate. If you found this, then you've already made a choice. You kept going. You listened. You didn't break in to take, you dug to understand. That matters. This treasure isn't stolen. It was protected. During the war, the people who placed it here weren't smugglers. They were guardians. They knew the chaos that was coming, and they chose to save something that might save someone else one day. We never got the chance to finish what we started. Too many names lost. Too many letters undelivered. If you're the one holding this now, then it's yours. Not just the gold, the responsibility. Do good with it. Or at least, do something that would have made us proud. No signature. Just a postscript. And if you ever meet someone named Evelyn Rhodes in Charleston, tell her AW never forgot her. Casey leaned back, heart full and heavy all at once. It wasn't just treasure. It was trust. And she had no idea what to do with it. She spent the next day in silence. No calls, no noise, just working. She sanded the side wall down to bare wood and repainted it. She fixed a shelf that had been leaning since before she arrived. She replaced the blown fuses in the breaker box. It wasn't about distraction. It was about reverence. Because when you find something this big, you don't just cash it in and walk away. You stop. You think. You weigh it. The weight wasn't in the gold. It was in the legacy. And she could feel it, pressing against her chest with every breath. By sunset, she stood outside the garage, looking at the structure, not as a building anymore, but as a monument. This wasn't about fixing cars anymore. It was about fixing something older, something deeper, something worth remembering. The next morning, Casey didn't climb back into the tunnel. She didn't need to. She knew what was down there now, what it meant, what it demanded. Instead, she walked through the shop with a roll of butcher paper, a Sharpie, and a bucket of determination. She taped the paper to the largest blank wall in the garage, cracked open the marker, and wrote 3 words in bold, unflinching letters. Honor the build. It became her compass. She'd always thought of herself as a mechanic, someone who fixed what other people broke. But this wasn't just restoration. It was resurrection, of history, of forgotten stories, of a community that didn't even know what it had lost. And it all started with a sagging roof and a concrete floor that echoed like a heartbeat. Casey used a chunk of the gold, just 1 bar, cashed it quietly, legally, with the help of an old contact her dad had once trusted. No questions asked, just a wire transfer and a promise of silence. With that money, she bought supplies, lumber, sheet metal, new lights. She hired local tradesmen who hadn't had steady work in months. She didn't tell them about the tunnel, just that she was rebuilding something worth believing in. They came without asking why. It started with Frank Dillard, a retired welder who brought his own tools. Then Cassie Nguyen, a high school shop teacher who said she'd help in exchange for a workbench and a place to teach after school. A group of veterans from the VFW showed up next, quiet, weathered, nodding when they saw the plans. They knew legacy when they saw it. The garage changed fast. Pipes were repaired. A new compressor installed. Walls were scraped, repainted. The cracked concrete in Bay 2 was sealed, polished, and reinforced, but she left the original seam. Not hidden, not covered, but marked with a brass plate that read, "Beneath this floor, a story was kept." And above it, on the wall, she framed one of the letters from Anna Weller. She didn't do it for show. She did it because when you inherit someone's secret, you owe them the truth. Word spread. A local reporter stopped by, asking about the sudden renovation. Casey smiled, wiped her hands on her coveralls, and said, "Just fixing what was never finished." People didn't press, but they kept coming. Someone donated a new lift. A nearby community college offered a small grant for vocational training. And when Evelyn Rhodes showed up on a Thursday afternoon, gray-haired, cane in hand, her eyes trembling with memory, Casey didn't ask how she found her. She simply said, "He didn't forget you," and Evelyn wept. There are some debts that can't be paid in money, only in meaning. And every turn of the wrench now, every drop of paint, every floorboard laid by a calloused hand, it all added up to one thing: redemption. Not just for the ones who hid the treasure, but for a girl who spent her whole life fixing other people's mistakes only to realize her purpose was something far greater. She wasn't just restoring a garage, she was restoring belief. Fall came early that year. The leaves outside the shop turned to fire and gold, scattering across the gravel, lot like confetti from some quiet celebration the world had thrown for her. Casey stood at the bay door in the morning chill, a mug of coffee in one hand, her eyes on the horizon. The garage behind her hummed with life tools clinking, metal grinding, voices laughing. The place had transformed. But more than that, she had. Not into someone new, into someone whole. The girl who once crawled out of her pickup and stared at this broken building with more hope than reason, now stood at the helm of something bigger than any dream she'd dared to have. She hadn't touched the rest of the gold. Not yet. It wasn't time. She kept it sealed below, the tunnel reinforced and protected. Not out of fear, but out of respect. What she'd uncovered wasn't meant to be spent all at once. It was meant to be honored, unfolded slowly, given where it mattered most. The letters from Anna Weller said as much. This is not a prize, this is a purpose. So she used it with intention, funded a scholarship at the community college for women going into trades, donated anonymously to a local food bank that had been scraping by. Quiet acts of impact, the kind that didn't make headlines, but made history in someone's life. The garage became more than a place to fix cars. It became a school, a sanctuary, a story. People came not just for tune-ups, but for truth. They came to feel what had been buried, possibility. One Saturday afternoon, a boy no older than 10 wandered in with his mom, wide-eyed and shy. He ran his hand across the polished hood of an old Dodge Dart they were rebuilding, then turned to Casey and asked, "Did you build all this?" She smiled, crouched down, grease still on her fingers. "Not alone," he nodded. Like that answer was the only one that made sense. Later that night, after the lights were out and the tools hung neatly on their hooks, Casey climbed back down the tunnel one last time, not to search, but to thank. She ran her hand along the brick wall, felt the cool curve of history, and whispered to the shadows, "We didn't waste it, I promise." The gold stayed where it was, but the weight had shifted. She no longer felt like she was carrying someone else's story. She felt like she was continuing it. When she emerged back into the garage, moonlight spilling through the skylight, she walked slowly toward the wall where she'd written those 3 words on butcher paper all those months ago. Honor the build. It had started as a motto. Now, it was her mission. And as the wind rustled through the open bay and the engine of her own life roared to life in her chest, she realized, some roads aren't paved with asphalt. Some are paved with choices. And every time you choose to believe in something buried, something forgotten, something broken, you lay another brick in the road ahead. $1 million road, not made of gold, but of purpose.